What if you were trapped in a place where the ground never stopped shaking, where the sky could fall at any second, and where every hour could be your last? This is Khe Sanh, 1968. Before the explosions, before the siege, before the world even knew its name, Khe Sanh was just a remote combat base carved into the rugged hills of Quang Tri, near the border of Laos. But this quiet outpost sat dangerously close to one of the most important lifelines of the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Through dense jungle, hidden valleys, and mountain passes, supplies, weapons, and soldiers moved silently south. To the United States, Khe Sanh was more than a base. It was a watchtower over that invisible highway. To North Vietnam, it was a threat that needed to be contained or destroyed. By late 1967, signs of change began to appear. Patrols reported increased enemy presence in the surrounding hills. Footprints, fresh trails, distant movement in the fog. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The jungle was no longer empty. U.S. Marines began reinforcing the base. Trenches were dug deeper. Bunkers were strengthened with layers of sandbags and steel. Every position was adjusted with one assumption: something big was coming. Fog rolled over the hills almost every morning, reducing visibility to just a few meters. In that fog, anything could move unseen, and that uncertainty became its own weapon. Intelligence reports warned of a possible large-scale attack. Some believed Khe Sanh could become another Dien Bien Phu.
Coordinates coming through. Sector 3, Echo 9. Enemy on the ridge.
The idea was chilling. A remote base, surrounded by hills, dependent on air supply. The parallels were impossible to ignore.
Confirms targets are moving inbound. Over. Roger. Keep your heads
Yet,
up.
the orders were clear. Hold the base. Marines rotated through patrols, constantly probing the surrounding terrain. Sometimes they made contact. Brief firefights in the jungle.
Push up. I'm out. Reloading. Watch that flank.
Sudden bursts of violence, then silence again. The enemy was there, but never fully seen. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese forces were preparing with patience and precision. Troops moved through Laos, bypassing detection. Artillery pieces were dragged through impossible terrain. Supplies were stockpiled in hidden positions around Khe Sanh. Every movement was calculated. By January 1968, the noose had already been placed. It just hadn't tightened yet. Inside the base, life continued, but tension grew heavier with each passing day.
Stay alert. Copy that, Eagle. Visual confirmation negative, but we'll maintain vigilance.
Letters from home arrived less frequently. Sleep became lighter, conversations shorter. Everyone felt it, even if no one said it out loud. Then came the 21st of January, 1968. At first, it was just a distant sound, then another, and then the sky exploded. Artillery shells slammed into the base with devastating force. Explosions tore through bunkers, runways, and supply areas. Within minutes, chaos replaced order. One of the first shells hit the ammunition dump. What followed was catastrophic. A massive explosion shook the entire base. Flames shot into the sky. Secondary blasts continued for hours. It was no longer preparation. It was war. Marines scrambled to their positions. Orders were shouted over the roar of explosions. Radios crackled. Smoke filled the air. Visibility dropped. The siege had begun, and there was no way out except through it. Outside the perimeter, unseen in the hills, the forces that had prepared for months were now in position. The trap had closed, and Khe Sanh was now at the center of one of the most intense battles of the Vietnam War. And once the first shells fell, the war at Khe Sanh did not come in waves. It settled in, like something that refused to leave. The explosions did not stop after that first day. They continued, hour after hour, day after day. The ground itself seemed alive, shaking constantly under the force of incoming artillery. There was no front line in the traditional sense. The entire base was the front line. Every bunker, every trench, every sandbag wall could become the next point of impact. Marines adapted quickly. They had to. Survival depended on it. They learned to read the sound of incoming shells. The faint whistle that could mean life or death. A short whistle meant it was already too late. A longer one meant a few seconds to react. Those seconds became everything. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the constant smell of burned earth. Day and night lost their meaning. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by explosions that shook men awake before they even realized they had closed their eyes. And yet, the siege was not just about firepower. It was about isolation. Khe Sanh was cut off. Roads were too dangerous. Ground resupply was nearly impossible. Everything had to come from the sky. Transport planes and helicopters flew into one of the most dangerous airspaces of the war. They came in low, through fog and gunfire, carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Sometimes they dropped cargo without landing, using parachutes that drifted unpredictably in the wind. Not every drop landed inside the base. Some fell into enemy-controlled areas and were lost. Pilots knew the risks. They flew anyway. Many aircraft were hit. Some never made it back. Inside Khe Sanh, the wounded kept coming. Medics worked without pause, often under fire, treating injuries in cramped, dimly lit bunkers. There were moments when the number of casualties overwhelmed everything. And still, the expected massive ground assault did not come. That uncertainty became psychological pressure. Every night, every movement in the dark could be the beginning of something bigger. But it never fully came. Instead, the pressure remained constant. Outside the base, North Vietnamese forces controlled the surrounding hills. From those positions, they could observe, adjust fire, and maintain control over the battlefield. It was a war of positioning, patience, and endurance. In response, the United States unleashed overwhelming air power. Fighter jets, bombers, and B-52s struck targets around Khe Sanh in massive numbers. Entire sections of jungle were obliterated. Hills were reshaped by explosions. The earth itself seemed to be torn apart. It became one of the most heavily bombed regions in the history of warfare. And yet, the siege continued. The scale of destruction did not immediately break the encirclement, because this was not just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of endurance. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched longer. Time slowed, distorted by exhaustion and constant danger. Letters from home became rare. Radios became the only connection to the outside world. And inside each bunker, each trench, each exhausted soldier carried the same silent question. How long can this continue? Because the truth was, no one knew. Not the men on the ground. Not the commanders. Not even the planners far away. Khe Sanh had become something larger than a battlefield. It had become a test. Of strategy. Of willpower. Of how much destruction could be endured before something finally gave way. And still, as February turned into March, the siege did not break. It only tightened. And as March dragged on, with the weight of weeks pressing down on every man inside Khe Sanh, something began to change beyond the hills. The siege had not broken, but plans were already in motion to break it.
Adjusting target area, sir.
No, hold position. Too vulnerable.
Suggest flank maneuver through the ridge.
Far from the trenches and bunkers, commanders had made a decision. Khe Sanh would not be left to fall. A coordinated effort would push through the jungle, reopen the roads, and relieve the base. That effort would become known as Operation Pegasus. But between the rescuing forces and Khe Sanh stood miles of dense jungle, hostile terrain, and entrenched opposition. Nothing about this would be easy. Columns of U.S. and Allied forces began advancing slowly toward the base. Every step forward had to be fought for. The jungle concealed everything. Visibility was limited. Ambushes were constant threats.
What's up? Watch the trees! Tracers! Fall back! Fall back!
Roads were damaged or mined. Bridges destroyed. Movement slowed to a crawl. Engineers worked under fire, repairing paths just enough to allow convoys to move. Meanwhile, inside Khe Sanh, the men could feel the shift, but they could not see it yet. The shelling still came. The danger had not disappeared. But there were signs. More aircraft arriving. More coordinated strikes beyond the perimeter. Something was happening. By early April, the advancing forces were getting closer. Contact intensified. Fighting became more frequent, more direct. What had been a distant siege was now turning into a multi-directional battle. And then, the distance closed. On the 8th of April, 1968, the first ground link was established. Relief forces reached Khe Sanh. The siege, in its purest form, was over. But the battle itself had not simply ended. The surrounding area remained contested. Operations continued to secure the region, push back opposing forces, and stabilize the situation. Inside the base, the change was immediate, but complicated. For the first time in weeks, isolation was broken. Fresh troops arrived. Supplies flowed more reliably. The wounded could be evacuated more efficiently. But the cost of the siege was visible everywhere. Craters scarred the ground. Destroyed equipment lay scattered. Bunkers were damaged. Trenches collapsed. Entire sections of the base reshaped by weeks of bombardment. And the men were not the same. They had endured something few could fully understand. Continuous danger. Constant uncertainty. The psychological weight of waiting for something that might come at any moment or never come at all. And yet, they had held. The question now was no longer survival. It was purpose. Why had Khe Sanh been held for so long? What did it achieve? Those questions would not be answered immediately, because even as the siege was lifted, a new phase of the story was already beginning, one that would lead to a decision few expected, because holding Khe Sanh and keeping it were not the same thing, and what came next would redefine everything that had just been fought for. And as the siege was broken and the pressure around Khe Sanh began to fade, a question remained. What now? The base had survived months of relentless bombardment. It had endured isolation, fear, and constant threat. It had been held at great cost. But survival was only part of the story, because now the war had shifted. Across South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive had already reshaped the battlefield. Khe Sanh was no longer the center of attention it once was. And in the months that followed, commanders reassessed its value. The conclusion was unexpected, but decisive. Khe Sanh would be abandoned. After everything that had happened, after all the effort to defend it, the base would not be held permanently. The decision was strategic, but to those who had fought there, it felt different. In June 1968, preparations began. Equipment was removed or destroyed. Structures were dismantled. Anything that could not be taken was eliminated. The base that had once been a fortress became a controlled demolition site. Explosions once used to defend it were now used to erase it. One by one, positions were abandoned. And finally, Khe Sanh was left behind. What remained was silence. A scarred landscape. Craters where hills once stood. Burned earth where life once existed. And memories carried by those who survived. The comparison to Dien Bien Phu had followed Khe Sanh from the beginning. But in the end, the outcome was different. Khe Sanh was not overrun. It was not destroyed in a single decisive battle. Instead, it was held, endured, and then abandoned. And that made it something more complex. Because Khe Sanh was not just about victory or defeat. It was about the nature of modern war. A war where massive firepower could reshape the land, but not always decide the outcome. A war where positions could be held at great cost, only to be abandoned later. A war where survival itself became the objective. For the soldiers who were there, the meaning of Khe Sanh was not found in maps or reports. It was found in moments, in the sound of incoming shells, in the mud beneath their boots, in the silence between explosions, in the faces of those beside them. It was about endurance, about holding on, when there was no certainty of what came next. And that is why Khe Sanh remains one of the most powerful stories of the Vietnam War. Not because of how it ended, but because of what it revealed about war, about strategy, and most importantly, about the people who lived through it. Because long after the bombs stopped falling, and long after the base disappeared from the map, the story of Khe Sanh never truly ended. It simply lived on, in memory.